very much, Amanda. But not only does that very clearly prove what you were saying about workplace exposure standards, but it's also quite shocking that that's actually something that's happening in a country similar to this one. It's not happening in some developing country where you might expect standards to be lower. It's happening in the United States of America. And it's quite astonishing to hear that coming out just now. Fortunately, people are speaking on the platform who will be around tomorrow at conference as well, and you'll have plenty of time to come up and speak to them at various breaks of conference and at the workshops that they'll be taking part in as well. I say that because we're not going to have much time for any questions or discussion tonight, unfortunately. Because I need to introduce our last speaker who's going to reinforce a lot of those messages again, who's Andy Watterson. Sorry, no. I'm going to get that off. I've known Andy for even longer than I've known you here, because I knew Andy when he was actually a tutor for the GMB at their college in Altrincham, before he became professor at Stirling University, and before he embarked on the work he has been doing for some years now on toxic use reduction, and that's what he's going to be talking about. So over to Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. I really want to pick up some of the themes that, in fact, both you and Amanda were referring to. So I'm going to talk about toxic use reduction. Amanda finished on a sort of an uphill note, a positive note. And I think that there are some very positive messages that we can latch onto in very difficult times, as Hugh has referred to. So I'm going to talk about what's termed toxic use reduction. It's been around for decades. In fact, if we go back further than that, I think it's probably been around for 100 or so years. People looking for safe substitutes for hazardous substances or less dangerous substances. And it was only recently I thought, where's the word toxics come from? And in fact, it means a poisoned arrow. And I thought, well, that's quite a good way of looking at it. Although there is a downside to this, because on the left there, I think that's Boris Johnson at Agincourt, leading the troops to retake France, I think. And I used to have a bad dream about it, and then I had a nightmare about it. And as Hugh has said, it's reality now. And I can see him not being particularly interested in this area. But if you think about it, in terms of toxic arrows, poisonous arrows landing on us, there are all of these substances that we've heard about that land on workers and that land on communities, in terms of asbestos and diesels, obviously, all sorts of solvents, a whole range of chemicals. And perhaps that's a good way of thinking about what's going on in the workplace and how we can link to things. So I'm going to talk about what toxic use reduction is. I should say what it is not right at the beginning. And this links to a chemical policy that's just come out from the House of Commons Environment Committee. And they talk about a policy which will engage in biomonitoring. Hang on a minute, how's that going to address a lot of the hazards that we've just heard about that need urgent action? They also say we want more research. You ask a university researcher what they want. Let's do more research, more money, more status. But in fact, a lot of research has been done, and it's sufficient to take action now. Again, we've heard about that from the previous two speakers. And what this body also said, that links in very much with what Hugh was talking about, they said actually we want to give more resources to Public Health England and the HSE. We've heard about the toll that's been extracted across the UK in terms of poor health and safety. And Public Health England, of course, was the key body in failing to identify that 40,000 people each year are dying from air pollution. Many of them will be workers. Often the pollution is going to be coming from a range of directions. So not interested in that, interested in something else. I'll have a look at the tools and resources that are around, because there are these practical solutions to what we're doing. And I'll very briefly have a couple of case studies to go through, which illustrate some of the problems, some of the tensions. Because toxic use reduction can do lots of things, but it's not a quick fix. There's elements of strategy in it, there's elements of tactics in it, and you need to be pretty thorough about what you're doing. But it is all feasible. It is all doable. And finish perhaps picking up some of the points that Amanda and you made in terms of the ways forward. Okay, So what is toxic use reduction? The definition is that it's an approach to pollution prevention that targets and measures reduction in the upfront use of toxic materials. Bit of a mouthful, that's from our American colleagues, but basically it's about identifying hazardous substances and working out less hazardous substances that can be brought in, or changing processes. And we do have examples of how this operates, because it operates in the workplace and it operates in the wider environment. Picking up, I think, Amanda's point, that if you can make the link, you may be very effective. And that actually links in with the trade union campaign with regard to clean air and so on. So there have been some, and there still are some blue-green alliances in the US. I think Scott Schneider from the American Labourers Union said that this has been revived. It's where trade unions and communities get together and talk about how to address toxics. I think the biggest step forward was the Toxic Use Reduction Act, which came out in Massachusetts State, and I'll say a bit more about that. And you could say, well, the European Chemicals Agency, with lots of problems, also has some sort of commitment, perhaps not as successful as it should be at all, but nevertheless, you could say it's got a toxic use strategy in there. And of course, it's embedded in REACH. European Agency for Safety and Health could do more on it, but it actually doesn't. California's Green Chemistry Initiative does the work to present the solutions to some of the problems about the toxics. So we can draw on that. You know, globally, we can access all of these sources of information. What the Toxic Use Reduction Act says in 1989 was that it wanted to cut toxic use, it wanted to cut byproduct use, it wanted to establish toxic use as the preferred strategy for complying with dealing with hazardous substances. And for them, it was about promoting the competitive advantage of industry. I should stress that, in fact, in Massachusetts, it also covers hospitals, it would cover local authorities, it would cover schools as well. So the idea was you'd be able to reduce the production and use of toxic chemicals. And it works, that's the thing. And Republican governors and Democrat governors, they all accepted it, it is still going. And between 1990 and 2016, these are the last years we've got the figures for, over that period, they were able to cut toxic chemical use by 66% and byproduct production by 72%. So it's something that's successful. The reason they like it is because it improves worker health and safety, it reduces environmental pollution, and it actually benefits the community. So they talk about it as a win-win-win strategy. The focus is primarily on the big users of chemicals, but it doesn't mean you can't roll it out to smaller ones. And they've got 500 companies at the moment in that state signed up. This is even with Trump. So, what's the idea then? The principles that govern it are about problem solving. They're not about problem shifting. So if you're solving the problem, you're looking at hazard removal. You're looking at what's technically feasible and practical. You're looking at how you can remove hazards at source, and that's embedded, you could say, in COSH and also in REACH. And it fits into these ideas about sunsetting hazardous chemicals, about just transition, so that you don't leave the workers behind if you're moving away from a particular chemical use or technology. And it fits in with citizen science and participatory action research, the sort of things that Hazards has been looking at. And there's a direct link as well with the environment and green jobs, control of work, in terms of alternative economic strategies, in terms of economic benefit. For instance, the Danes that have done a lot of work on this, they found if you got rid of 4 phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors, you'd save Denmark 1 million krones a year. So there are these economic benefits as well, which is why industry and government should really like it. And it does map into sustainability and climate change. Problem solving isn't about problem shifting. And what we see all too often is jumping out of the frying pan into another frying pan. Amanda gave us an example with tripe. But even worse, we could jump out of the frying pan into the fire. So that's why, as I say, it's not a quick fix. You need to do a good deal of research in terms of picking up the problems. Problem shifting would be to say, well, we'll move the risk away from the manufacturer and hazard onto the supplier. We'll move it from the supplier to a manufacturer. And the manufacturer will say, we'll move it from us, the company, to you as the workers, that we've heard about right at the beginning with the little play. And it's the sort of safe work and not safe workplace approach. And you can see how that can operate. You know, you could shift something in terms of crop production away from the farmer and the farm worker, but you could put it through to the food processor. You could change something about how you deal with laundry by introducing nanomaterials. So you wouldn't necessarily get somebody up the line in terms of producing goods having the problem. You would push it down along. And you can get what I think the Europeans call regrettable substitutes. So you could substitute tripe by N-hexane. Everybody jumped on BPA as a problem, brought in BPS, which is just as big a problem. So it's looking for alternatives that actually work. I think Grenfell, in some respects as well, is an example of where things went seriously wrong. And if we had a toxic use reduction strategy, then we would be a lot better off. Some people say, well, you don't need it. It's already built into COSH and REACH. You know, the laws are there. There are benefits to be gained from using toxic substances. And, you know, this is music to Boris and Co.'s ears. It would be unnecessarily intrusive if you had these government interventions. And anyway, there aren't any safe substitutes. Well, that's exactly where toxic use reduction comes into its own, because it's looking at what the substitutes are, checking them out thoroughly, and making sure that they work. Okay. So thinking about the tools, you can literally go on the web now, and you could access the Toxic Use Reduction Institute and the Toxic Use Reduction database that exists in Massachusetts, which would tell you about a lot of the substances that's already been referred to. So you don't need to go out and do a lot of research in that sense. It will be drawing on possibly what's there, but having a strategy and a set of tactics in the workplace. The Danes have done this. They don't like to talk about toxic use reduction as such, but they do have this Danish toxic policy, and Amanda's referred to the Swedish one. And they talk about you have to generate the information, so you collect the knowledge, you push it out, and then if you can do it, although Hughes raised lots of problems about it, you can try and regulate it. What's interesting about the Danish approach is that they actually have a centre for substitution. I'm not aware of anything like that in the UK. So they're taking this seriously, and they can see all of the benefits that operate. Okay?
The slides are moving on.
Sorry, I've got it down. Oh, you got one of them. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the sort of tools there then would be getting this information. It would be looking at health impact assessment statements, and this is looking at the bigger picture, not just what happens to the worker in the workplace, but what happens outside, something called the exposome. You can look at cumulative health impact assessments here as well, and the life cycle analysis. So that's looking at the product right at the beginning, the extraction, right the way down the line, and looking at all of the occupational health problems. And in that, the focus actually is the hazard. So we hear endless guff in many respects about risk assessment and risk management, and they sort of drag you in to this particular setting without the same amount of thought going into what is the hazard and do we have to use it. So that's absolutely critical to this approach, and that's about primary prevention of the disease. You can then access this database. You get all of the information about the particular properties of materials in a particular sector. For instance, here they're looking at electronics, wire and cable, military and aerospace, and so on. So we could do it just for education. There's a lot of stuff out there, and you would get the information then to work out a strategy for toxic use reduction. Sorry, this is looking at the unforeseen negative environmental, worker and public health effects. It works. We've heard Amanda talk about Trike, so we can see practical examples early on of how it operates. Okay. I won't talk about both these case studies then. I'll just talk about crumb rubber as an example. So crumb rubber is used in 3G pictures. Crumb rubber is used on children's playgrounds, and it could come from a range of sources. So if you're looking at the toxic use reduction there, you'd be thinking about the people who make it, and basically the HSE has spent little time on that, inspecting. You look at the people who actually install it. You would then look at the people who are maintaining it, and then you would look at the public, the community that's actually using it. And you can see a whole range of substitutes possible for crumb rubber that might include things like coir and cork and so on. And of course, you could actually use grass. Very innovative, very revolutionary material. But if you're thinking about toxic use reduction, the players popped up with glyphosate. So if you were looking at using grass, then you'd have to consider what you're going to be putting on the grass. So you wouldn't necessarily be saying everything is safe, and you may be increasing risk somewhere and reducing them elsewhere. That's why I say it's not necessarily a straightforward process. But also, there's an issue then about the sort of rubber that's being used. And the European industry has actually been making the point recently, if you stop us using rubber tyres, which is the usual thing in crumb rubber, because we don't meet the standards, you could be importing them from India and China, and the United States, back over to Boris and Trump. You know, that's the sort of thing they'd like to do, don't need health and safety regulation. So you can now, literally, in 30 minutes, you could link it to all of these case studies across a whole range of areas. So a lot of work has been done. Obviously, you would then need to look at the strategy in your workplace. And that's why I think, going back to Hugh's point, it's probably worth focusing on developing a toxic use reduction strategy for the materials and processes you use, and then putting it to the management. We can save you money, we can stop pollution, we can improve health and safety standards. And if you work it through, that certainly is feasible. Hazards, the hazard centres, the TUC, the STUC would be really good sources there. In addition to that, if Boris goes and something better comes along, and it's difficult to think of anything worse, then you might be able to start to look at getting better laws and regulatory agencies. But the key thing is you can adopt a toxic use reduction strategy in your workplaces now.